Thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning. My name is Jesse Starita, and I am the Public Relations and Engagement Coordinator with the Nebraska Water Center. We're a part of the Doherty Water for Food Global Institute. That is our name. And we're living up to the global billing with seminars both last week and this week that feature two of our in-house visiting Brazilian scholars. And last week we had a nice presentation by our visiting PhD student, Jessica Garcia Nascimento. That is on our YouTube channel, and I'll post a link to that later on. And this morning we have part two in that installment of our visiting scholars, and Paulo Pires, who will be introduced momentarily by Christopher Neal, our director of research, has been here for most of 2020, and it's not his first time in Nebraska. And I just want to say personally, it's been really wonderful, Paulo, to get to know you. I feel like I know maybe more about you as a person and less about your research. So I'm really looking forward this morning to learning more about the work that you've been doing, both in Nebraska and previously in Brazil. So and he leaves soon. So this is the last chance that we're going to get, for many of us, the last chance that we're going to get to see Paulo on Zoom. So with that, I think I will turn things over to our Director of Research, Dr. Christopher Neal. And one last thing, since this is just a standard classroom Zoom, if you can, and you're all on such good Zoom etiquette right now, you've all muted yourselves and turned off your videos. But if you can continue to do that during the talk, that will help out a bunch. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Jesse. Good morning, everyone around here, and good afternoon for those that are attending from Brazil. I'm Christopher Neal. It's my pleasure to introduce Paulo de Tarso Pires. Paulo is a professor of environmental and rural law at the Federal University of Paraná. That's in Curitiba, the capital of the state. Paulo and his family were here for a year and a half, working. Paulo was working at the Institute with us. He helped us with our engagement with FAO, and he's going to talk of the publication that came out with his input during his presentation. And Paulo also became my biking buddy over this period, right? And including a trial by fire of actual mountain biking in the mountains. So hopefully he'll be able to continue biking once he's back in Brazil. So with that, Paulo, I'll give you the floor, and then at the end we can have a period for answering questions. And folks, if you want to ask a question in the chat box as well, that will work, and we'll compile them all to ask at the end, okay? Paulo, please, you've got the floor.
Thank you very much, Christopher. And I need to say that the biking part is one of the best parts of my experience here in Nebraska. The bike rides here are amazing. And I need to, first of all, say thank you to the Water for Food Institute and for Christopher Neal and Peter and Jesse for being organizing this event. And I need to say thank you for FAO too, because we are participating as partners in this water tenure paper discussion. And so I will present this, this work that I'm developing here, that is part of a bigger work with FAO and Water for Food. Now I will share my presentation with you. Okay, just a second. Okay, now I have this here. Okay. And so the title of my work here is Water Tenure in Agriculture, a comparative study between Paraná and Nebraska state. And my main objective in this work is to apply this new concept that FAO is developing in the situation of two different states in two different countries that have similarity conditions in considering social and economical aspects, and very important, similar activities in agriculture too. And so for the people that already is working with water rights, it's something different to work with this new concept that it's water tenure. And why FAO is trying to develop this concept of water tenure. This concept, it's a new concept that has its roots in the consecrated concept of land tenure. And in this case, it's important to understand that we need to have a connection between the water tenure and the land tenure. And so the new concept developed by FAO in 2016 is water tenure is the relationship whether legally or customarily defined between people as individuals or groups with respect to water resources. And so what is the difference between the traditional waters rights and the water tenure? The first and very important difference is that when you are talking about water rights, we are considering more the formal law, the formal contracts, mainly the land and water contracts, people by people, state by state, private by public. And when we are talking about water rights, the main focus is in the private relation. And we are talking about the water tenure. Something important is that we consider not just the formal law, but we must consider the religious law, the local law, and the informal agreements that we have between people and the local state and the local government. And in these aspects, we need to consider the verbal agreements and things like that. When we start this research, we need to consider that religious aspect, it's very important, mainly for part of the population today. For example, for the Muslims, they consider that water is free, ever free. You never can gain working with water. And so you need to consider these aspects to create a governance, a policy, a water policy for that. For some indigenous people, they considering the water, the secret, something transcendental. They not just consider as a resource, but something that they need to use as their gods and things like that. And the other things that's very important in the difference between water rights and water tenure is that the water tenure, you give a more public aspect for the water rights. You give more community focus for the water rights. And you must consider the social relationship. And so, just to emphasize, for the traditional water rights, individual and personal relationship, it's the most important. For the water tenure, the social and community relationship is the most important to establish these rights. To develop this, we participate in a meeting in Rome FAO. And during this meeting, we discuss what will be the base, the main sources to create the water tenure. And so we create this score of the water tenure that we call the bundle of rights. And the bundle of rights, this group of rights, we have to consider 5 important rights to construct this new concept. The first one, the use rights. We need to consider that the people have domestic use, livelihood use, agricultural uses, commercial uses, but they have use for pleasure, for example, for sports, for cultural, for religious use. The other important right in this score is the exclusion right. In this exclusion right, considering the right that the person, the owner, had to exclude others from his property, from his water use, from his territorial water resources, in cases of abuse of capture or abuse of use of the other. And so you have the use of the right, you have the right of exclusion of a person that is abusing the right of use the water in your property or in a water of a community. The other important aspect is the transferability of the rights. And so when you are considering the water tenure, you have the capacity to transfer, to sell, to lease the water rights. And this is very important because you can transfer your rights for another person, for another owner, and you don't need to transfer the land, but you can transfer your water rights. And this is another important aspect of the bundle of the rights. The other aspect is one of the cores of the discussion is the governance and management rights. And so this is something, it's a key in this discussion because when you're talking about the management rights, include the rights to plan, but not just to plan, but to make decisions regarding the allocation of the water and the use of the water. And in this case, we are talking not just about the public power, the governmental power, but the power of the community to decide which use will be the best for that situation in that local. And finally, the procedural rights. The procedural rights is the right to assess the information, to develop activities, or to negotiate impacts, or to mitigate impacts, to participate in decisions, to appeal decisions in courts, and to receive fair compensation should considering the water rights that was infringed or extinguished. And so this is the bundle of the rights. This is the root of the water tenure. This is there are the main aspects that you need to consider to construct the big concept of water rights. And so the main objective of my work here in this case, considering that you understand the concept of the water tenure that is different from the water right, the main objective of this work was and is to make a comparison between the systems of law and water governance in 2 states in different countries that have similar agricultural production systems and social and economic similarities applying the new concept of water tenure. And so we construct this concept, and in theory, this is a perfect concept. And the next step is try to apply this concept for the new realities, for the new places, and this is part of my work. And so let's talk a little bit about, and very briefly, about the traditional water rights in United States. In United States, it's very clear that there is two main theories and doctrines of water rights. The first one is the riparian rights. The riparian rights is land-based, and so it's very correlated the riparian rights of the water with the land right. So who is the owner of the land has the right to use the water, since you don't cause damage for the other property or the other in the other property. The riparian rights is a surface water mainly, for surface water mainly, and comparing with the other doctrine, appropriative rights or prior appropriation, that it's something that it's very much applied here in Nebraska. For riparian rights, the base is the land-based. For the appropriate rights doctrine, it's use-based. And then we say, first in time, first in right. The first people that use has the right of the water. The surface water, the riparian rights mainly applied for surface water. The appropriative rights or prior appropriation, you can apply very easily for surface and groundwater. Other important aspects comparing these two different doctrines that you can use here in the United States is that the riparian rights, you don't lose by non-used. If you don't use, doesn't matter. But for appropriative rights, if you don't use the water, you lost your rights. And so not lost by non-used and lost if you used. Riparian rights, the other very important point is that it's considered part and parcel and are passed with the title to the property. We call this the real rights in the civil rights. And so if you sell your property, the water rights will go with the land rights. But it's interesting because the appropriative rights exist without regard to the special relationship between land and water. And so this is a very distinct water rights doctrine here in the United States, but studying this, we can see that nowadays, in most part of states in United States, for example, California, here in Nebraska, the judiciary is applying, and the doctrine is applying a mix of both systems of riparian rights and appropriative rights, depending on the situation. Just to remember that the appropriative rights, it's very strong in states like California that had a strong colonization for mining, and in the beginning of the colonization of California, they used a lot of water for mining. And in mining activity, you don't need the property of the land to have the right of the water, because this is in the beginning was very strong, the appropriative rights in places like California. At the other hand, for places like Texas, riparian rights was very important because the people in general, they develop agrarian activities, rural activities. And in general, for this kind of activity, cattle, soybean, you have a big connection between the land use and the land right, and the water use and the water right. And so it's important to understand the history of the colonization of the place to understand why you apply more or less this doctrine or for one place or another place. Comparing with Brazil, the traditional water rights in Brazil. In Brazil, it's interesting because in the beginning, since 1934, we have a water code in Brazil. In the beginning in Brazil, this water code has the main objective not to protect the water as a natural resource, but to protect the water as a water code for the farmers or for the people in the cities to have the right to use the water for productive purposes like agriculture, like sanity, electrical, hydroelectric production, and things like that. But after a long time in Brazil, in 1988, we have a new constitution in Brazil. This is a federal constitution in Brazil that changed the view according to the use of the natural resources. We call this the Constituição Cidadã because the social color of the constitution is very strong. And in this case, considering the water rights after the federal constitution of 1988, the water passed to be a public good legally protected resource. And so we don't give protection just for the owner of the land, but we give the protection of the natural resource of the water for all community, for all people in Brazil. And so this changed totally the governance of the water in our country after the Constitution of 1988. For sure, we have the water code that determine the correlation between properties, owners, and things like that, and the property of water and the property of land. But we have the National Water Resource Policy that create a system of water governance in Brazil. And it's important to say that we have the National Water Agency in Brazil that concentrates the power to manage the water in Brazil. We have a new civil code in Brazil. You need to remember that when you are talking about United States, we are talking about common law system. When you are talking about the Brazil, we are talking about civil law system, and this is it's a different system. The civil law system is more formal, and we have more right laws and less customs. And in this case, in Brazil, something very important is our civil code. The new civil code is from 2002, and in this civil code we establish important relation, but not just for the use of the water, but the relation between owners, between farmers, and the necessity to respect the quantity and capacity of the river and the aquifer to maintain the good neighborhood. And in this case, in Brazil, it's important to say that the doctrine of prior, like United States, the doctrine of appropriative rights or prior appropriation, we don't apply in Brazil. In Brazil, we use or the community use of the water as a public good legally protected, or a riparian rights. And in this case, the landowner's rights over water are respected, but generally lack state grant and permit for productive uses. Sorry about my English, it was confused. Let me try to explain again. The riparian rights, it's very important in Brazil. The civil code and the constitution protect these rights, but something that it's important to understand is that in Brazil, the control of the state, it's huge. It's very strong, the control of the state by natural resources, in natural resources. And in this case, you have the right to use considering riparian rights. But besides that, you must have a grant, you must have a permit, you must have a license of the state for productive uses as irrigation, fish farming, and mining, and things like that. And so, just to see some points of our water rights systems in USA and Brazil. In USA, the private rights is very strong. In Brazil, the state control is very strong. In Brazil, the governance and the legal water system is defined by decentralization in the United States. It's very interesting because you have federal law here, federal laws here, United States, but the management, the governance of the water in general is decentralized. You have a decentralization. But in Brazil, it's different because we have a concentrate governance. Our constitution says that, our federal constitution determines that the water, it's a public resource, and the rivers are a federal goods, a federal good. And so the water and the aquifers that cross more than one state in Brazil are federal goods in Brazil. The other thing important comparison, the both water legal system is that in USA, there is an important focus, you emphasize the economic and productive aspects. In Brazil, mainly after the federal constitution of 1988, we have a very strong color of social and public aspects. Going for a more detail, let's try to compare Nebraska and Paraná state. Nebraska is a state in the Midwest of United States, and the total area of Nebraska is 200,000 square meters, kilometers, 200 square kilometers, and 77,000, more than 77,000 square miles. And in Paraná state has a similar area. We have 30, almost 200,000 square kilometers in Paraná too. But the population of Paraná is much bigger than the population of Nebraska. In Nebraska, we have 1.9 million people. In Paraná, we have more than 11 million people. And so the density of Paraná state, is a much more dense state than Nebraska comparing. And so the total area, 2,000 square kilometers of Nebraska and 199 kilometers, square kilometers in Paraná. The GPD of Paraná per capita is almost $7.982. The GPD in Nebraska, it's bigger, it's $31.339. And so comparison, the social condition, the economical condition of Nebraska is much better than Brazil. Considering that we are working with water tenure, it's very important to understand the history of colonization of Nebraska and Paraná to evaluate if the legislator considered the history of the state to construct the water law system or not. This is not an important aspect considering the traditional water rights system, but it's a very important aspect considering the water tenure system. And so Nebraska has the large growth in population in 1970 and in 1870s, in the 1880s, with the people attracted by the prairie that is very good in land, and that is perfect, the prairie land for cattle grazing. And so in the beginning of the colonization, after the Native American Indians, the colonization of Nebraska, the main activity was cattle grazing. In Paraná, for another hand, the beginning of the colonization of Paraná state was the exploitation of gold, mainly in the coast of Paraná. And this kind of exploitation of natural resources starting the end of the 15th century and was 15th century and was extended until the end of the 16th century. And a little bit different of the Nebraska, the Paraná start with exploitation. The industry of the Paraná start with, after the mining, with the exploitation of wood, mainly with a species of tree that we call Araucaria angustifolica or Paraná pine, that was very good for furniture and houses and things like that. And the erva mate, that it's important plant to produce tea in Paraná state. And after the economical cycle of the cattle in the Nebraska, we can see that in the 19th century, start a different movement to improve the agriculture in Nebraska, mainly considering the improve of the technology for agriculture, for irrigation, for the treatment of the lands and things like that. And so, in this case, after the cattle cycle the states start a new agriculture cycle. It's a very important one, mainly with irrigation used for soybean and corn. And in the 19th century, another big movement in Nebraska in the meat industry that start packing a lot of to export for other states and for other countries. This is a very important aspect of the colonization of Nebraska that we need to consider when we are analyzing the water law system. In Paraná state, for another hand, we have a colonization for the Jesuits that opened the east part of the state, and the east part of the state is more appropriate for some soybean plantation and corn plantation, and with migration from São Paulo state and Rio Grande do Sul, we start a new cycle of coffee, and cattle in Paraná state. And so in both states, we have a beginning with the Native American people for sure. After that, in Nebraska with cattle, in Paraná with wood exploitation. After that with cattle in Nebraska, and with soybean and corn plantation in Paraná. And in the end of this time, we have a very strong movement for the agriculture industry in both states. Nowadays, Nebraska has a large agriculture sector and is a major producer of beef, pork, corn, soybeans, and sorghum in United States. It's one of the majors. Paraná, for another hand, has a very strong agriculture with soybeans, wheat, sugarcane, cassava, beans, orange, coffee, and erva mate. And 40% of our GPD in Paraná comes from industry, and 15% of GPD in Paraná comes from agriculture. And it's interesting because in Nebraska, major part of the GPD comes from agriculture. Nebraska has another industry and another activities as freight transport by rail and truck, manufacturing, telecommunications, information technology, and a very strong industry of insurance in Nebraska. But the main sector, the main activity that imposes the economy for sure is agriculture in Nebraska. In Paraná State, it's agriculture and industry. We can consider in both very important activities. But a different situation that we have in Paraná State, considering the water consumption, is that in Paraná State, besides the agriculture, besides the soybean, beans, corn, coffee, we have a very strong industry of paper and cellulose. And almost 7% of the area of Paraná is nowadays is covered by forest plantation like pine and eucalyptus in Paraná State. And so we have a lot of forest plantation in Paraná State to give and to work for the paper and cellulose industry at Paraná State. Just to show you this, this is the consumption of water in Paraná, the water used in Paraná. And in Paraná, 27% of use of water goes to animals. The consumption of the water, sorry about that. 22% goes for urban uses, 30% for industrial uses, 4% is rural uses, and 20% of the water consumed in Paraná goes to irrigation. And this is a very interesting aspect because in Paraná, we don't have a lot of areas with irrigation for soybean or for wheat. We have most for seeds, production of corn and soybean, but we have a small area of irrigation in Paraná. But the consumption is comparing with the area, it's really, really big in Paraná State. And in Nebraska, for sure, Nebraska leads the national in total irrigation area. And so in Nebraska, the biggest part of the agriculture consumption in water goes for irrigation. So this is a very interesting aspect that we can compare between both states. The water governance in Paraná State, it's very centralized in the federal level. And we have the federal board that works with the environmental ministry and the Ministry of Water and Energy. And we have a federal agency that we call ANA. The ANA is a federal agency that control the management of the water in the level aspects and make the plan to manage the water in the base for the states and the local communities. And we have in Brazil the local councils that we call comitês de bacia, the watershed councils that make the governance in the local level in Brazil and mainly in Paraná State. And as we can see here in Paraná, in Brazil in general, we have a concentration of the power to manage the water and to create plans for the water and create laws for the water in the federal level. You can create the laws in the state level or local level in Brazil, but you need to considering first the law, the federal law, and after that, the state can create its own law, but considering the federal law and need to be more strict than the federal level. At another hand, in Nebraska, we have a very interesting form of governance. We have a decentralization here to manage, to give license, to give permits, and this is a very interesting way to implement the water tenure in Nebraska. And we call the natural resources districts in Nebraska. And the natural resource districts in Nebraska has the statutory purposes for water. And the main purpose for the natural district is prevention of damage from flood water and sediment, flood deprivation control that we had a big problem last year here in Nebraska with flood, soil conservation, water supply for any beneficial uses, development, management, utilization, conservation of groundwater and surface water, pollution control, solid waste disposal and sanitary drainage, and drainage improvement and development and management of fish and wildlife habitat. And make a comparison, this is very interesting considering the governance of the water in both places, because in Paraná, in Brazil in general, in Paraná, the state has the responsibility to conserve, to preserve the water and to make the enforcement to preserve and to control the uses of water. But in general, the federal level, the federal legislator that will create the law about the uses of water. And so the federal level will create the law, and the state level will implement the law, and the local has a very small power to control and to participate in the use of law. This is changing. This is really changing now with the watershed committees that we created, but we already have a very strong control, a very power concentration in the federal level in Brazil and in Paraná state. And this in Nebraska, it's very interesting because you can see that there is a decentralization of the power, and with this decentralization, sorry about that, we have more transparency in the decisions. We give more power for the communities to participate in decisions, and we can push the public government, the government and the public power to really implement what the law says about the water conservation and the water management. Almost going to the finish of my presentation, the positive aspects considering the water tenure in Nebraska and Paraná in a comparison of both. The first one is that Nebraska has a very good monitoring and control of water quality and quantity, and this is a result of the decentralization of the governance of water in Nebraska. And so the power is decentralized in Nebraska, and you have more transparency, you have more popular participation, and this is very positive. Very positive aspects considering the construction of the water tenure doctrine. The other very important aspect is the creation of the natural resources districts and the governance with the natural resource districts, it's much easier than in the central power. In the Paraná, we have positive aspects too, that we can say that the protection of water resources come from constitutional amendments in Brazil. This is a very positive aspect, because the federal constitution of Brazil has amendments about the water conservation, the water use, not just for this generation, but the future generations. The other positive aspect in Paraná State is the new system of water control, considering the watershed committees and the new institute of water and land that we have in Paraná State. And the other very important and interesting aspect that we have in Paraná State is the implementation of Brazil Forest Code. And why I'm talking about the Brazilian Forest Code, considering the water tenure, because the Brazilian Forest Code has very important amendments about the importance of the preservation, the conservation of forests around the rivers, and the obligation of the owners of lands to maintain the forest with the main objective to preserve the quality and the quantity of the water. This is a very important aspect of our water law system in Paraná and comparing with Nebraska. The negative aspects, just to go into the end of my presentation, is in Nebraska, we can feel the high pressure by the agriculture sector, considering that the agriculture activity almost depend of the irrigation to survive, to produce. In Paraná State, for another hand, we have a protection of water resources coming from constitutional amendments. And this is a problem too, because for one hand, it's important to have a federal amendment, a constitutional amendment, but for another hand, you have a centralization of the power, and this is a result of the concentration of the federal law. The problem that we can find in both realities, this is a very, very bad problem that we have. A negative aspect is the lack of rights protection for Native Americans, considering the water rights. I was reading some papers here that the quality of the water in Native American places, reservoirs, it's 30 times worse, 20 times worse in the reservoirs comparing with other places. Why? Because in the Native American places, for the Native American people, they have less technology to make agriculture. They have less capacity to control their manures and garbage, and they are more susceptible disease and fecal problems. And so this is a big problem, that the lack of rights protections for Native Americans, considering the water tenure in Nebraska. In Paraná State, we have a lack of right protection for traditional people and considering water rights too, but in a different aspect, because in Paraná State, we have quilombolas that are African American communities, and we have indigenous people, both of people, very fragile people, susceptible problems with water contaminations, water quality, and people that these people are always in conflict with agribusiness and farmers, considering the lack of capacity to defend themselves, considering the lack of economical capacity for them. The last negative aspect that I need to talk about is about the climate change susceptibility that we can see here in Nebraska mainly, mainly considering the policy, the climate change policy in the last government. And it's urgent to develop a new instrument to protect the owner, to protect the population, to protect the communities considering the climate change and the problem that we have with quantity of quality of water in the next years in Nebraska, United States, and all around the world. And finally, the last negative aspect that I need to say that I found in my research is the power concentration in the federal level in Paraná state, in general in Brazil. This is a problem because sometimes the public power, the legislative in Brazil, legislative power, create new laws in the federal level, and they don't consider the local characteristics and the tradition of the people, the religion, tradition, and cultural aspects in the right law. And so my final comments, I need to say that considering my research, it's possible to apply the new concept of water tenure for the Nebraska and Paraná water legal system, but it's necessary to adapt for different realities, for sure, and to remember that law is an instrument of policy and a tool to improve good governance. The second important comment is that there's an important difference between water tenure and law tenure you can see in Paraná state and in Nebraska. And this difference reflects directly in the correlation of private and public sector. And finally, it's necessary a change in the law as an instrument, but it's fundamental a reconstruction of water policy system, considering the modern society, new demands and desires. And just to my final comment, I need to say that I think that this is just one more episode in environmental law history. And in the meantime, more change will come and the law could be improved for the better of the environment and people. This is my hope. Thank you very much. And this is the link of the work that we already developed with FAO, and it's available in the FAO site. Thank you. And now, Jesse, the microphone is yours.
Muito obrigado. Thank you, Paulo. Hey, pretty good for a lawyer. You kept it to 50 minutes.
Thank you, Jesse.
Maybe I'll turn things over to Dr. Neil. I know he has a meeting coming up soon, but since we do have a couple minutes, maybe he could offer a closing comment and then turn the floor over to Q&A.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Paulo, for that presentation. And thank you again for the work you've done. And it's been a pleasure having you and hosting you here at Water for Food Institute. And we hope that our relationship doesn't end with you leaving. It's going to continue, right? As we have several things in the mill. So let's continue developing those potential projects and working together in the future. I don't see any questions in the chat right now. I have a question, maybe to start off, and those who want to ask questions could type them in the chat box. The question I have is, now that irrigated agriculture is really growing in Brazil and many places in the country, a lot of these systems draw from existing rivers. They pump water out of rivers, and sometimes there's conflict, right? Because now you're using water for a consumptive use, not necessarily just a beneficial riparian use of the water. And so how do disputes get resolved now when they come up? on over allocation of water in rivers and people pumping illegally or over adjudication of water in rivers?
It's a very interesting question, Christopher. Thank you. And in the past, all of these conflicts, at the end of the day, will finish in the judge. But nowadays in Brazil, we are working more and more with the watershed councils. And one of the objectives of the watershed councils is exactly to mediate these kind of conflicts, because they are more local, they have a direct contact with the people. And so, for sure, in some cases, we need to have the support of the judiciary in extreme cases. But it's getting better and better of people going for mediation, for other kind of resolution of conflicts in Brazil. And this is a key to have a better process of governance in our country. One problem that we have is that in some places that we have a traditional use of water as fish farms and fisheries for traditional people, now we have more and more agribusiness. In this case, we need to have the action of the public ministry and the public prosecutor to defend the interest of the community, the fragile community, the weak community, and the poor community that depends on this resource to survive, and to make this balance between the agribusiness and the community interests. I don't know if I answer your question.
Yeah, thank you. Let's see, are there any other questions? Peter's got a question, and before Peter asks the question, I'm going to bow out as I have another meeting starting at 11. But please stay on. Thank you all for attending. And Jesse will moderate from here on. Thank you again for everyone, and Paulo.
Thank you, Christopher. Thank you very much for all support during this time.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Paulo. Thank you, Jesse, for organizing this. I really enjoyed it. Unfortunately, I had to step away just towards the end of your presentation there for a few minutes, so I may have missed this. But I'm curious, as I was listening to the last part of your presentation, have you reached the point where you've got actionable ideas that you would like to implement or even recommend for Nebraska? There was broad recommendations at the end, but really implementable ideas that you see in comparing these water tenure settings?
One thing that I think that could be very important, the first is try to develop a new law considering the Native Americans' water for the access and the use of law. This is a very important aspect. And then we see that nowadays, the Native Americans, they are very, very poor considering the use, the quality and quantity of water. The other important aspect that we need to consider is to analyze the water law rights and the environmental law in the same system. Nowadays in Nebraska, you can see that you have a closed box considering the water rights and a closed box considering the environmental law. This conversation is fundamental to have the correct use of the water and the conservation of the resource. And so sometimes we can feel that both some institutions, the environment institution and the water institution, they don't talk. And this is a very bad aspect and must change considering the water governance in Nebraska. This is some point that I need to talk about. Thank you, Peter, for the question, very important question.
Paulo, we had a question come in on chat asking about if there's a growing demand for alternative water, and that could include recycled or captured rainwater in Brazil.
Yes, there is. It's important to say that we have a very different approach of urban areas and rural areas. And in urban areas, you have more law about the necessity and obligation to recycle water and to use the rainwater, the water coming from the rain. And the rural areas, in Paraná state, for example, we don't have a lot of irrigation. We have some irrigation, but for the industry, they have the obligation to recycle and to preserve. And if they don't preserve, they must pay for the use of the water in Brazil. This is something that we are already trying to implement, but this is a very important aspect that we need to consider.
Paulo, kind of along the same lines as what Peter had asked you, in your report and research for the FAO paper, are there places already in the world that you've found that are realizing the water tenure model that you're proposing and really doing it on the ground? And if that does exist, could you just share an example?
We are just beginning to work with water tenure, and our hope is try to implement beginning in place with weak loss system. For example, in places that they have a lot of informal law, but they are starting to transform this informal law in formal law. And so we will use the water tenure system to kept all the tradition of the people, to don't lose the rights of the traditional people to create the formal system. You are trying to work this in some countries in Africa now, and probably in some parts of Brazil, try to implement this kind of things. But I need to say, Jesse, that the water tenure concept is a concept in construction. And we are starting to apply this concept now to transform and to build new legal systems.
Great, thanks, Paulo. I'm going to put in the chat a link to the Water for Food YouTube page, and we have a lot of videos up there for people to peruse. And we'll share this video from Paulo's seminar in the next couple days, so check back for that if you want to go back and rewatch some parts or share it with people who you know might like it. I think with that, I'll give maybe one more chance if anybody has a question that they haven't had an opportunity to ask yet. Seeing none. Oh, yes, go ahead, Paulo.
I want to give my final words. I need to say thank you very much for Water for Food Institute for this possibility to stay here in the United States and to give me all the support to make this research. And mainly in the person of Peter and Christopher Nail. And thank you, Jess, for organizing this event. And I need to say thank you for FAO too, in the person of Eduardo Mansur, Marlos, and Benjamin, and the other part of the group that gave me the possibility to participate in this important construction of the water tenure concept. Thank you very much, Jesse, and thank you, Water for Food.